The lobby of Meridian Financial Group smelled the way all serious money smells: cool air, faint cedar, and the particular silence of people who have been told their time matters more than yours. By noon, the man standing at the front desk would cause every senior partner on the 14th floor to walk down personally and wait for him in the lobby. Not the boardroom, the lobby. He had arrived at 8:47 in the morning. His name was Daniel Carter. He was 43 years old, and he wore a gray fleece over dark work pants, the kind you buy in a 3-pack at Canadian Tire. His boots had dried mud on the left heel. He carried nothing: no briefcase, no folder, no laptop bag. Just his hands in his pockets, and a quiet way of standing that took up very little space. The receptionist at the front desk was a young woman named Simone Bellard. She had worked at Meridian for 8 months and had learned in those 8 months that the way a person dressed told you almost everything you needed to know about how much of your morning to spend on them. She looked at Daniel Carter and made her calculation in under 3 seconds. "Can I help you?" she said. The question had the shape of helpfulness without any of its substance. "I have a meeting," Daniel said. "9th floor." Simone's eyes dropped to her screen. "Name?" "Carter, Daniel Carter." She typed, she scrolled, she typed again. The particular way she pressed her lips together told a small story. "I'm not seeing anything," she said. "It may be under the Alderton file," he said, "or listed as a consultation. It was arranged through your legal team. Sir, if it's not in the system, I can't send you up." She tilted her head slightly, a gesture that managed to be both apologetic and dismissive at once. "You're welcome to call whoever arranged the meeting and have them contact us directly." Daniel looked at her for a moment, not with frustration, not with the rehearsed patience of a man suppressing anger, just looked, as though he were reading something faint on a page. "All right," he said. "I'll wait." He stepped to the side, away from the desk, and sat down in one of the low chairs near the window. Outside, a February wind was moving through the financial district, shaking the bare oaks along King Street. He watched it for a while. He did not take out his phone. Simone forgot about him within 4 minutes. The lobby of Meridian was not an unfriendly place, exactly. It was a place designed to make certain people feel at home, and other people feel like they had wandered in by mistake. The floors were dark marble. The reception desk was backlit white acrylic. There were orchids on a side table, the kind that are never quite real-looking enough. A man in a charcoal suit came through the revolving doors at 9:05. Simone stood slightly straighter. He signed in, received a visitor's badge, and was escorted to the elevator by a junior associate who appeared from a side hallway with the efficiency of a person who had been watching for him. Daniel watched this. He said nothing. At 9:22, a security guard named Rick Thibodeau did a slow circuit of the lobby and paused near Daniel's chair. "You waiting for someone?" Rick asked. "I'm waiting for someone to check their records," Daniel said. He said it without sharpness. It was simply accurate. Rick looked at him the way a man does when he can't quite find a rule being broken but feels certain something is off. "Okay," he said finally. "Just checking." Daniel nodded. Rick moved on. At 9:38, Simone looked up and seemed mildly surprised he was still there. She had, in the intervening time, sent up 4 visitors, taken 2 calls, and eaten half a granola bar. She walked over to him with the careful expression of someone delivering news they have decided is reasonable. "Sir, I spoke with my supervisor. If you don't have a confirmed appointment in our system, we really can't. Would you call the 9th floor directly?" Daniel said. "Ask for Patricia Drummond. Tell her Daniel Carter is in the lobby." "Ms. Drummond is very busy," he agreed. "Tell her anyway." Something about the way he said it stopped Simone mid-sentence, not because it was rude. It wasn't rude. It was simply certain. The kind of certainty that doesn't require volume. She went back to her desk. She made the call. What happened on the other end of that call, she would think about for the rest of the day. She heard the line connect, heard the pause of a secretary, heard herself say the name, and then heard, from the other end, a sound that was not quite words, more like the sound a person makes when they've been holding something carefully for a long time and it has just slipped. He's in the lobby," the voice said. "Yes," Simone said. "He's been here since." The line went quiet. "Then don't let him leave, please. Don't let him leave." The 9th floor of Meridian Financial Group housed the senior partnership offices and 3 dedicated client suites. It was a quiet floor, intentionally so, carpeted in charcoal gray, lit by recessed fixtures that gave the light a quality of considered seriousness. The kind of floor where the decisions that affected other people's lives were made in low voices over good coffee. Patricia Drummond was the senior managing partner. She had been at Meridian for 19 years. She was 51 years old and had the kind of reputation that preceded her into rooms. not as a matter of ego, but because people who had worked with her knew in a concrete and specific way what she was capable of. She had rebuilt the firm's real estate division after the 2018 restructuring. She had navigated 3 regulatory audits without a single material finding. She was not, by any credible account, a person given to panic. When Simone's call came through her assistant, Heather Moss, Patricia set down her pen mid-sentence in a meeting with 2 junior partners and said, simply, "Excuse me." She walked out of the conference room without explanation. In the elevator going down, she stood very still. She was doing something with her face that the elevator's reflective doors caught only partially. A controlled breath, a deliberate settling of expression. The kind of preparation a person does when they know they are about to walk into a moment that will require more of them than the last hour has. The lobby doors opened. Daniel Carter was still sitting in the chair by the window. He was watching the street outside. He turned when he heard her heels on the marble. Patricia crossed the lobby in 11 steps. She extended her hand when she was 3 steps away. "Daniel," she said, "I am so sorry." He stood. They shook hands. His grip was brief and without performance. "It's all right," he said. "It is not all right," she said quietly. "How long have you been down here?" "About 50 minutes." She closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Then she opened them and turned to find Simone, who was watching from the desk with the expression of a person slowly understanding they have made an error whose dimensions they do not yet fully know. "This is Daniel Carter," Patricia said, and her voice had not risen, which somehow made it land harder. "He is the lead environmental assessor on the Alderton remediation. He is the reason we have a file to work with. He is the reason we are not currently in front of the Ontario Securities Commission explaining a $40 million oversight." She paused. "Please update the system." Simone said nothing. There was nothing to say. Patricia turned back to Daniel. 14th floor, she said. "The team has been waiting." He nodded, picked up nothing from the chair because he had brought nothing, and walked with her to the elevator. To understand why the 14th floor had been waiting, you have to go back 11 months. Meridian Financial Group had been engaged as financial advisors on the acquisition of a large parcel of contaminated industrial land in eastern Ontario. The kind of deal that looked, on paper, like a straightforward brownfield redevelopment. The kind of deal that happened 50 times a year in corridors like these, signed off on by people who trusted the summaries they were handed. The problem with summaries is that they are written by people who have read other summaries. Daniel Carter was not a person who read summaries. He'd grown up in Sudbury, the son of a man who drove haul trucks at a nickel mine and a woman who kept a garden that refused to grow properly in the soil behind their house. The soil, Daniel had understood by the time he was 12, was contaminated. Not dramatically, not visibly, just quietly, persistently wrong in a way that nothing you planted in it could quite overcome. He had studied environmental science at Laurentian, then spent 6 years with the federal government before going independent. His firm, 2 people, himself and a technician named Ross Beauchamp, was not the kind of firm that got invited to the Meridian lobby often, but he was the kind of person who, when handed a contaminated site, actually went to the site. He had spent 4 days at the Alderton property in March. He had walked every section. He had taken samples that the initial assessment, the one Meridian had relied upon, had not included. He had found in the northeast quadrant evidence of subsurface migration from a decommissioned fuel storage system that the original environmental report had noted as remediated on the basis of a document that was, as Daniel had subsequently confirmed, 19 years old and signed by a company that no longer existed. The liability attached to that oversight, if the acquisition had closed on the original timeline, would have been Meridian's. $43 million minimum, possibly more. He had written his findings in a report that was 51 pages long and had no executive summary. Because he did not believe in executive summaries, he had sent it to the legal team, and then he had waited. For 11 months, the Alderton file had lived in a complicated space between legal, finance, and the senior partners, each department aware of the problem, each aware of what it meant, each aware of what it had cost them in revised timelines and renegotiated terms. What none of them had done, until Patricia Drummond looked at the lobby security log that morning and saw his name stamped at 8:47, was actually invite him in and say thank you. The 14th floor boardroom had a view of Lake Ontario on a clear day. This was not a clear day. The lake was somewhere behind the gray, present but not visible, the way certain facts are. There were 7 people in the room. Patricia had preceded Daniel by 40 seconds, enough time only to set her coffee down and take her seat. The others, 2 senior partners, a legal director, 2 associates, and the firm's chief risk officer had been there since 8:30 for what had been calendared as an Alderton file review. When Daniel walked in behind Patricia, the legal director, a man named Charles Weatherby, looked up from his papers and went slightly still in the way people do when a piece of information arrives that reorders everything else on the table. He had read the 51-page report. He had read it 3 times. "Mr. Carter," Charles said. He stood. The 2 senior partners stood. The associates reading the room stood. Daniel sat down. There was a beat, a small silence of the kind that accumulates when a room full of people realize, more or less simultaneously, that they have been thinking about a situation in a way that required correction. Patricia said, "I'd like to start, if everyone agrees, with an acknowledgement." No one disagreed. "The Alderton remediation report," she said, "was filed 11 months ago. It identified a liability we did not know we had. It prevented, conservatively, a $40 to $60 million exposure. The person who wrote that report sat in our lobby for 50 minutes this morning because his name was not in our appointment system." She looked around the table. "I want to make sure we understand what that means." The chief risk officer, a woman named Barbara Eng, set down her pen. Charles Weatherby looked at the table. One of the senior partners, a man named Gordon Hale, who had been at Meridian for 26 years, looked at Daniel with the particular expression of a person reviewing a decision they cannot unmake and have decided it is more useful to understand than to regret. "I read your report," Gordon said, "in March. I remember thinking whoever wrote this actually went to the site." "I did," Daniel said. "The Northeast Quadrant section," Gordon continued. "The part about the subsurface migration. That's not something you find from a desk." "No," Daniel agreed. "It isn't." Gordon was quiet for a moment. "How did you know to look there?" Daniel considered the question as he considered most things, unhurriedly, without performance. The original report noted remediation of above-ground infrastructure. It didn't account for what happens when fuel migrates below the frost line over a 19-year period. In northern Ontario, that's not a theoretical concern. It's standard. It wasn't standard in the initial assessment. No, it wasn't. The room absorbed this. The associates were writing. Barbara Eng had picked her pen back up. Patricia was watching Daniel with the focused attention of someone cataloging something they intend to use. "I owe you an apology," Charles Weatherby said. He said it plainly, without the hedged language that often softens apologies until their structure collapses. The report was circulated internally. The name on the cover was referenced in memos. No one, myself included, took the step of making sure you were in the system, were contacted, were treated like the person we actually needed to talk to. Daniel said, "You're talking to me now." "We are," Charles said. "Yes, the meeting ran until noon. It was not, by the standards of Meridian's boardroom, a dramatic meeting. No voices were raised, no accusations were made. What happened was more specific and, in some ways, more serious than drama. A room full of careful, experienced people reassembling their understanding of a file they had believed they understood." Daniel walked them through the subsurface findings in detail. He explained the migration pathway, how the contamination had moved, over 2 decades, from the decommissioned storage system into the surrounding soil matrix and, in 2 places, into the groundwater. He explained what remediation would actually require, as opposed to what the original report had described. He explained the regulatory timeline, the provincial notification requirements, the federal environmental protections that applied to the adjacent wetland that the original assessment had classified incorrectly. He used no jargon that wasn't necessary. He answered every question completely. When Gordon Hale asked something that showed he had misunderstood a technical point, Daniel corrected him without making the correction feel like correction. At 11:15, Barbara Eng asked the question the room had been moving toward for 2 hours. "What would have happened," she said, "if this acquisition had closed on the original timeline before your report?" Daniel thought about this. Not about how to answer it. He knew the answer. He was thinking, as he sometimes did, about how to say an accurate thing to people who had spent their careers in a world where accuracy and its consequences could sometimes be managed apart from each other. "The contamination would have transferred with the asset," he said. "The buyer would have inherited the liability. When the groundwater issue surfaced, and it would have surfaced, within 3 to 5 years, possibly sooner, the regulatory response would have been mandatory. At that point, the question of who knew what and when would have become a legal question rather than a financial one." Silence. "You're talking about personal liability," Gordon said. "Potentially," Daniel said. "Yes." Gordon looked at his hands. He was a man who had spent a long time being careful, and he was sitting with the specific discomfort of understanding exactly how close careful had not been. Patricia said, "The report arrived in time." "It did," Daniel agreed. "Because you went to the site." "Because I went to the site." She nodded slowly. There was nothing performative in it. It was the nod of a person recording something in a way they will not forget. At noon, Patricia walked Daniel to the elevator herself. The associates had gone back to their floors. Charles was on a call. The lobby of the 14th floor was quiet. "I want to talk about the next phase," Patricia said, "the remediation oversight. Whoever manages that file is going to need someone who has actually seen the ground." "I know," Daniel said. "Would you be available to continue?" He looked at the elevator doors. "I'd need to review the scope, and I'd want the engagement documented properly this time, not just a report filed and circulated internally." "Agreed," she said. "Completely agreed." The elevator came. He stepped in and turned. "There's a wetland on the eastern edge of the property," he said. "About 2 acres. The original assessment flagged it as non-jurisdictional. It isn't. It feeds into a creek system about 4 kilometers north. If the remediation plan doesn't account for that, the timeline will collapse." Patricia looked at him. "That's not in any of the documents I've seen." "No," he said. "It's in my field notes." The elevator doors closed. Downstairs, Simone Bellard was eating lunch at her desk, a habit she had because the lobby needed coverage, and because the break room on the 2nd floor had a particular fluorescent light that made everyone in it look slightly unwell. She had spent the morning thinking about the 50 minutes. Not with guilt, exactly. She was not yet sure what shape the feeling was. But she had been thinking about it with the specific attention a person pays to something that has revealed a gap between what they thought they were doing and what they were actually doing. She had thought she was maintaining order. That was the job, wasn't it? To filter, to prioritize, to ensure the lobby ran the way it was meant to run. And she had filtered. She had prioritized. The lobby had run. She had just been wrong about what order meant. The man in the gray fleece and the muddy boots had sat in the chair by the window for 50 minutes, watching the street, not asking for anything, and he had been the most important person to walk through the doors all morning. She thought about this. She thought about the fact that he had known when he said Patricia Drummond's name, had known when he said it was all right when it wasn't, and he had waited anyway. He had not made a scene. He had not demanded. He had waited with the patience of a person who understood that certain things work themselves out and that making noise about them generally doesn't help. She was not sure, she thought, that she could have done that. At 12:43, a man in paint-stained cargo pants and a faded Carhartt jacket came through the revolving doors. He had snow on his shoulders. He carried a battered nylon bag. He stopped at her desk and gave his name. Simone looked up from her screen. She found the appointment. She printed the visitor badge. She stood and said, "Let me call the associate who's expecting you." "Just one moment." She made the call. The associate came down. The man in the cargo pants was escorted to the elevator. It was a small thing. It was the correct thing. She had been doing the correct thing all morning, she thought, just using the wrong definition of correct. She filed that away and went back to work. 3 weeks later, Daniel Carter returned to the Alderton property. It was early March, the kind of day that couldn't decide between winter and something else, cold enough for his breath to show, warm enough that the snow along the site's perimeter had begun to pull back from the fence line, revealing the particular gray-brown of soil that had been under ice for 4 months. Ross Beauchamp was already there when Daniel arrived, setting up the sampling equipment near the northeast quadrant. Ross was 31, methodical in a way that had taken him years to calibrate to Daniel's pace. Not slow, but deliberate. He acknowledged Daniel's arrival with a nod and kept working. They spent 6 hours on the property. Daniel walked the eastern edge in the afternoon, along the boundary where the original assessment had drawn a line and called everything beyond it outside the scope of concern. The wetland was there, as it had been in March, as it had been for decades before the industrial use of the property and would be for decades after, a low depression fed by snowmelt and groundwater, populated by the kind of reed grass that grows where water remembers itself even after it's been told to go away. He stood at the edge of it for a while. The creek system it fed was 4 kilometers north. The contamination plume, as he had modeled it, would not reach the wetland for another 8 to 12 years under current conditions. That was, in the context of environmental liability, not a long time. It was the length of a child's elementary education. It was the time between one federal election and the third one after it. It was long enough to feel abstract and short enough to be someone's actual problem. The remediation plan, as he intended to write it, would account for the wetland. It would account for the creek. It would account for the things that weren't visible yet, but were moving quietly through the ground. He took his samples. He documented the site conditions. He wrote notes in his field book in the tight, precise handwriting he had used since university, not because no one made apps for this, but because a field book could be rained on, frozen, dropped in mud, and still read. He had learned that from his father, who had kept a small notebook in his shirt pocket for 30 years of shift work, because the things you wrote down were the things you were willing to be accountable for. At 4 o'clock, the light began to change. The sky over eastern Ontario did what it does in early March, turned a flat, specific shade of pewter that made everything look like it was waiting for something. Ross was breaking down the equipment. "Same quadrant?" he called. "And the eastern edge," Daniel said. "I want comparative readings from both." Ross nodded. He had stopped asking why Daniel wanted things years ago. The why, he had come to understand, usually became clear in the report. Daniel walked back to the truck. He sat in the cab for a moment before starting the engine, looking at the site through the windshield. It was, in the way that most industrial land is, neither beautiful nor ugly, just a place where certain things had happened and other things were being decided. He thought, briefly, about the lobby, about the chair by the window, about the particular quality of being in a place where everyone around you has made a decision about what you are, and waiting for the moment when the information corrects itself. He did not think of it with bitterness. He had learned a long time ago that the gap between what people see and what is actually true is not a personal problem. It is an old and persistent feature of the world, and it is most dangerous not when it is malicious, which is rare, but when it is simply unexamined. Simone Ballard had not been malicious. She had been unexamined. That was the common version. He started the truck. The field book was on the seat beside him, sealed in a Ziploc bag against the damp. 51 pages of the next report were already taking shape, in that quiet way that serious work assembles itself. Not all at once, but in layers, each sample and observation adding to the picture until the picture is complete enough to be trusted. He pulled out onto the county road and drove north. Behind him, the Alderton property sat in the fading light, the contamination continuing its slow migration through the substrate, patient and invisible and entirely indifferent to what anyone thought they knew about it. The only thing that would stop it was someone who had actually gone to look.